This is such a lively discussion. Thank you, everybody. There are a lot of questions over in the chat, and I'm trying to look at them and grab ones as they are relevant to what the discussion is at that moment. And I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, but save them into your breakout rooms, because certainly our panels can address them there as well. Sally, you're back. We'll let you finish where you were. Not sure if she can unmute herself, so we see. I'm going to come and try to unmute you really quick.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, yes. You would. Anyway, so very, very quickly, I'm conscious, sorry about, I don't know how I disappeared. And I would say, and it came up in our discussions, that it's the practitioner that's, and again, it just reinforces what Jessie said. And so in our program, which is 10 weeks, in the first 3 sessions, the practitioner will clearly want to get to know the group individually, the group will get to know each other, and from those first 2 or 3 weeks, and then at a micro level, you identify, has somebody got a garden, have they got a balcony, have they got access to an allotment, so you can start to personalize their experience as to how they can take what they're learning forward, and it's not assuming various things, but then as a group, they come together and personalize the rest of that program, and that works with the site. And we've had groups that have chosen to build a pizza oven and had a project which is personal. So we've picked up that there's quite a fear of standardization amongst the practitioners, that it's going to be regimented and it's not going to work for the clients. But in our experience, a program structure at an operational level works for this client group because they're used to military training culturally, they're used to a program, and then it's the practitioner that's key, as they would professionally, to work with a group to personalize it. Right. And so it does work, and it is to put
your own magic in there. That's how I've referred to it. Like every individual practitioner or program has their own magic that they bring into that consistency and standardization that then makes it theirs.
Yeah, and then the sum is more than a total of the parts.
Absolutely. Nick, there was a question for you that I think fits well here. It says, can you talk about how and why we're manualizing the randomized controlled trial in Salt Lake City?
Yes, so...
And maybe explain what it is first.
Yes, this other project that Shift was the think tank for, it began last year at a similar panel as this. And we are working with Bill Marchand and Tracy Herman and some other people at the Salt Lake VA, Jackie Daniels. And what we're trying to do is they have a whole health program. It's actually kind of similar to what's run at the Naval Hospital and the active duty side here in Balboa, with kind of different aspects of holistic care. And they have a hiking program. And so we are writing an IRB right now to examine treatment as usual or standard care for PTSD, and compare it to patients who have this standard care plus a hiking intervention. And what else what was the question?
Talking about manualizing that.
Yeah.
Has it been manualized, or is that in process?
It's in process now. And again, it's, as we've talked about, it's important for participant expectation and having a manual that can be replicated and things like that, because that's a really important point for other programs and replication of research and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that was really good. This is all fantastic, and interestingly, our questions are leading into each other. Samra, I'm going to come to you. In the context of this manualization and standardization, we've heard that utilizing a theoretically grounded approach to program delivery can be another way to provide structure. So can you talk about that and how theoretically grounded programming can support a systematic approach?
Sure, and actually, I'm going to say how it can support both structure and flexibility and fidelity. So trying to throw the third one in there. I think, I'll start with the balance between flexibility and structure that many of us have been talking about, and I think many of our participants are probably interested in. So there are a lot of different theories now that programs can use to draw from as they design their program and as they think about outcomes. And many of those, I'll just mention a few from the human behavior side, which is often the frame that I work in, look at stages of change. So this is where I think it can be nice to use a theory like the trans-theoretical model, for example, that really just takes where is a person at in terms of goals that they might be setting for themselves, and what kind of stages of change do they go through along a continuum toward the end of the program. And there are a lot of ways to measure that. There are instruments that can measure, whether they are starting as what's called a pre-contemplator and ending up in action. And there are variations on that theme, but it also goes along with the notion that change is hard for people. People often take one step forward, two steps back, and it acknowledges the fact that, again, it's iterative, and you can document, if this is the approach that you want to deliver, a flexible way that you are personalizing, as Jesse said, within the bookends of a structured intervention, trying to help a client meet their goals through different modalities. But you're doing that in a way that is drawing on, some theory that's grounding it. There are many other theories from human behavior, from socio-ecological theory, even from the nonprofit sector around collective impact, for example, that can document everything from the return on investment to the actual experience of patients. And I think, again, it's being intentional about what you want to achieve, and then maybe partnering if you're a program that is, not in academic or has not partnered with academics, you could think about partnering with a local university. Cooperative extension in the United States is often a bridge between university practitioners and the people who are doing things on the ground in different states. And so there's all kinds of ways to connect to this body of literature that really can help you to create structure and measure structure while retaining that personalization and that flexible component.
Right. I've always thought of theories, this is like grad school 101. Back in the day, Jesse and I were graduate students at the same time in the same program, but learning about theories as basically a roadmap, like this is the path that we should follow in the services that we provide, and this is where it will get us. But it doesn't have to be a rigid path. The theories that we have at our disposal allow us to bring in that flexibility to a certain degree, to then be able to get to where we want to go. So I like to look at it as like a map, a roadmap to get to where we're going. That was so fantastic. Guys, this has been an enjoyable conversation. We have about 7 minutes left, and I think we have time to get to one more of our big panelist questions, and then hopefully we can get to some of these, our attendees' questions here. So Nick, coming back to you, what is reciprocity in the context of outdoor recreation, and what do we know about it? And is there a place for that within standardized protocols?
Yes, I am. Okay. Reciprocity in the context of outdoor recreation. So I think off the bat, it's important to acknowledge that the concept of reciprocity with the land is not a new concept. It's been part of indigenous communities for time immemorial. And so taking care of the land will take care of you. This is like grooming forests or harvesting sage or fire suppression, things like that. So what I'm speaking on, kind of like, or what we're all speaking on, mostly quantitative research in the written word is something that is highly valued on the whole by researchers today, or I should say it's highly valued by dominant Western institutions. So on the whole, researchers today, myself included, have to learn to balance kind of this paradox within our work and speak for its value, or else we're leaving certain things off the table. So reciprocity is getting healing by healing the land is kind of how I like to think of it. And this could look like, gosh, is it called Project Blue? There's a project that was a Shift Award winner last year, for example, that takes veterans and does dives with them for different types of ocean health. And I think that as Semra was saying earlier, and maybe she can add a bit here, is that there is absolutely a place for that in standardized protocols, but that this research that connects social consciousness and ecological care is important, and maybe she can add a little bit more to that.
Sure. So I guess two thoughts there, Nick. Thank you. And I totally agree that it's most important, I think, for us all to keep that in mind, so we don't maybe become too entrenched in the micro level while forgetting the forest for the trees, as the metaphor goes. But I think there's an emerging evidence base about the connection between experience in nature and greater social consciousness, engagement around environmental stewardship, and kind of those bidirectional benefits. But it is also an emerging evidence base, if we use the word evidence from the more biomedical framing that we've so far been mostly using here. But if we take that out a moment into really the bigger societal connections, I think we had a conversation before as we prepared for this panel that we have examples, again, from other cultures, other nations, for whom this is not a new concept at all. And we were talking about how there have been previous Nobel Prize winners. One was Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who pioneered the Greenbelt movement, in part to support healthcare for women, but also around planting trees and the goal of really promoting peace among nations as part of an environmental movement that involved planting trees in this case. And then another one of our panelists, Terry, reminded us that this year's Nobel Prize winner, Whole Foods Organization, is also using an environmental platform to advance human health and human rights in accordance with the World Health Organization's Sustainable Development Goals. And this reminds us that we're part of a global community. We might be talking about the US primarily here, and the UK and developed nations, but the things that we do in the developed world have a direct impact on the rest of the world, and our footprint is often fairly large. And we really need to keep in mind, again, how the things that we do and the choices that we make both empower individuals, but they can create a greater response to take care of each other and of our planet simultaneously.
Awesome. Okay, we have about 4 minutes before we're going to go onto our first break. For our panelists, does anybody want to add anything to what we've talked about so far in terms of standardization with flexibility and fidelity with flexibility, or our conversation about just now about reciprocity before we take our break?
And sorry, I have to correct, Terry just reminded me that it's World Food Organization, not Whole Foods. I think I was getting hungry and my my hunger is speaking for me. So World Food Organization. Thank you, Terry, for the correction. I didn't want to plug the wrong organization there.
Yeah, if you guys have time, scroll through the chat maybe during the break to look at all of the questions and the programs. People are talking about programs that they're aware of, research they know going on, different organizations doing fantastic things. And I'm sorry that we can't bring all of this into this conversation at this moment. But as I mentioned before, we will have breakout rooms coming up at 10 a.m. So thank you everybody for your expertise here. It's been fantastic. We will break off in 2 minutes, and have a 10-minute quick break. Come right back here promptly at 10 a.m. and we will go into breakout rooms where each of our panelists, myself, we have a few additional people who will be a host of one of those breakout rooms with a specific topic still on all of this same, or a specific question still on all of this same exact topic. So if you have questions that you've put in the chat, save them and ask them in your breakout room. But we might have time for just one question, and I will grab it from Christian. He just put it into the chat. He says, is reciprocity too far out there for an institution like the VA? Dun, dun, dun.
It certainly would be for the Ministry of Defense.
That we don't do like the frou-frou good feelings type of things. It needs to be much more medical focused.
Well, in fairness, they're slightly different, aren't they? Because the Ministry of Defence's core business is defence of the realm. It's not the veteran space. So I just meant in terms of a government organisation. So it's not the right comparison. I just meant in terms of a large corporate. You know, it's a difficult thing for them to think about.
Okay. So on the VA side of things, Jesse?
And I think it depends on how we approach it, right? I think that when you look at veterans, they understand reciprocity. Anyone in the military understands reciprocity, right? Like they are sacrificing their life for others so that their life could be better. They understand like how that reciprocity kind of works and how it will also connect to nature. And I think if we as a collective, not we us, start going down that path, I think more and more people will be able to get on board with it. Yes, but it will be a harder way than a very more regimented, easier to think about kind of approach than reciprocity. But I think that inherently, when we start talking about reciprocity, everyone does this, right? We get it. We understand that, like, yes, we are a part of the earth and we have to take care of the earth. And if we don't do that, we can't help ourselves, we can't help the earth, those kind of things. So I think inherently everyone gets it. So it just, how are we going to pitch it to the VA?
Yeah, well, I'm going to wrap this up really quick. I'm sorry, Sam, we're running out of time.
I have an idea of building on Jesse's, and I'll save it for breakout.
Yeah, well, and I'm just going to tie in Mark Smith's comment over in the chat, because I think you made the strong point here, is that the concept of reciprocity is not too far out there for the VA. It's just that they rely on evidence for these interventions. And so this goes back to everything that we have said in terms of building that evidence base and the rigorous research needed to do that. So on that note, we're going to
quadruple aim, which is readiness. So we'll get to that in our breakout.
Yes, and I wish that I could be in there to listen to that. So we're going to take a pause right here. We'll keep everything on, but come right back at 10 a.m. and we will split out into our breakout groups. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I think welcome back. It is 1:05 here in South Carolina, 05 everywhere else. Can't tell if people are back or not because we don't have a lot of cameras on, so, and that is okay. All right, I'm going to jump back into this. And I hope we have everybody here. So thank you, everybody, for coming back. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and experiences in your breakout groups for the next 50-ish minutes. We have time to bring those small group discussions back here into a larger discussion. Hopefully we can answer questions that were left unanswered potentially in those small groups. Feel free to drop questions into the chat for our panelists, and we'll try to look at those. Our room hosts will help us manage through that. And this is also actually a time to be much more open and ask our questions kind of in a more open and verbal dialogue, as opposed to being stuck in the chat. So feel free to ask questions here. But turning our time over back to our panelists here, let's start with that. To all of our panelists, what did you hear in your groups, and what were your main takeaways with regards to kind of our focus on standardization and outcome measurement and such? Anybody can take it away. That I'm not calling you out individually this time.
Then I'm going to go this time. I think one of the things that got brought up during my session, so I specifically was asking, what is it that we missed, or what information can you like add? And I really liked the conversations that came out because of this. One of the things that really people are still wanting ability to do this. How do I set up a program that can be manualized? How do I research a program? How do I, like, they want this, and they want to know how to do this. And a lot of times we want it to happen fast, but it's not a fast process. And so understanding, how do I even, like, what's the first step? How do I start? And we were kind of talking about that. Do we want to speak on that, or do you want me to just give you my overall, like, my 4 bullet points?
No, I think that that's a good one to speak on, because if I think there are a lot of people have those same questions of how do we actually do this? And it's worth spending the time to talk about that. So go ahead.
Yeah, and so I think we talked about in our group that partnerships are really important, that partnerships between providers and researchers, if that's at a hospital or at a university setting, it's a win-win situation, right? The providers have access to the population, the researchers have the knowledge of how to go about doing this. And so that's really important, to create those really good partnerships with people that the researchers are researching what you want to be researching as well, right? Like that the researcher isn't going to come in and tell you what you need to be researching. There's a really good partnership going on, and it's a conversation that goes on between the researcher and the provider.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important.
Yes, and I'm lucky. One of the persons in one of my breakout groups is somebody that I am partnering with, and I'm on the university side, they're on the program side, to be able to kind of illustrate that. And it is very important. And we all have our own skill sets, and we can come together and maximize our skill sets, certainly to benefit this overall effort here. And so that's great. Anybody else want to kind of throw anything out, what their takeaways were from their groups broadly?
I can throw out one, Jasmine.
Go ahead, Aaron, please. You go first.
Thanks, Simra. So our question was, if you're an organization or a participant, what you would need or what you would want to see when it comes to implementing any type of standardization. So most of the conversation was around, if you're an organization, what would you need in order to be able to standardize something? So it generally, overall, us understanding that there's a wide range of programs, a lot of different types of clients. So you can't generalize the entire population into one set standard. There's literally a very, very wide range of outdoor activities being used in different environments that people are accessing, different lengths of time of exposure. So different dosing with the participants, and then different types of clients, everything from very fit and able-bodied folks doing really physically challenging things to older, much less able-bodied people who are also outdoors, but doing much less different types of activities. I think that implied that the perception of risk would be different amongst the different types of groups, right? So how do you create a set of standards that allows for that enormous amount of different types of programs? And then within that list of standards, or that set of standards, how do you allow programs to select what would be best applied to them, instead of having to adopt something that would just overcomplicate what they're currently doing?
Mm-hmm.
If we try to overcomplicate it, they're not going to use it. That was the takeaway.
Absolutely. This is one of the things I think that maybe is I'm blanking the word right now, a misperception potentially between practitioners and researchers, right? That if a practitioner is being told, well, I need to either standardize or manualize or do some research, but I have to work with a researcher who's going to come in and tell me that this is how I have to do it, and it has to be this rigid or this prescribed or this, and that doesn't fit with how we do things. That could be a real deterrence to being willing to implement research in a program, or to implement a standardized approach to something in programs, right? And so I think that's a misperception that isn't actually, I think, the intent behind standardizing or manualizing or doing research. And I'm speaking from a researcher side of things, but I was a practitioner at one point in my life. And I remember back to those days and understanding that we want the flexibility and the ability to meet the needs of all of our clients across the board, right? So I think that's what we're trying to do today, is talk about finding that spot that works. Samra, did you want to say something to add on to Aaron? Or
and Sally and I both, we co-hosted, and one of the questions that we got a lot of great response from was, how do we get guidelines out there and still allow people to fit it into what they're doing, which was really the question that Sally came up with. And we had some great ideas from our participants, and one of them was really about rethinking what we mean by guidelines. So there's one way to talk about the guidelines for programs, but then we could think about all kinds of other ways of maybe broadening the definition of guidelines to think about, for example, what can we learn as researchers from practitioners that could be shared, kind of lessons learned with communities. And we started to think about different ways of sharing, whether it's the traditional kind of research lens that we've talked about, where we're evaluating something specific at a programmatic level, but our participants shared examples, almost like case examples of things that they were doing that, as a researcher and just as a citizen, as a human being, it was such a learning experience just to hear that. So thinking about a way to document stories that can also be forums for bidirectional learning. So that was something that came up, and maybe Sally could add on some thoughts about that too.
Thank you. Yes, the other theme that came out that I thought was quite powerful and works with what you're saying, Jasmine, that there's maybe a misconception, is the fact that I think it was from the Parks Association. A lot of the programs they're doing probably are fitting within guidelines, but that we would, in inverted commas, or standard guidelines that would be perceived to be useful practice as a foundation, but they're not necessarily writing them in that language, or we haven't had that conversation. So it's not necessarily, well, it isn't definitely a one-way conversation about here are some guidelines that we've made up, however diverse the Shift conference and how much we've already brought people. It's a continual journey to then look into what's happening, almost mapping it back the other way to say what's here already. So it is definitely picking up on this bi-directional. And I think the best news that I've heard, because there's so much to take in here, is everybody in our small group is very happy to, as Christian was saying, how can we get more people into this journey and into the working groups? So they've certainly all volunteered to continue the conversation so that we can move it forward, because I think I genuinely sense we're all working in the same direction. It's just going to take time to work out how to do this. It's not going to happen in the next 50 minutes.
Yes, no, and I absolutely agree that this is a lifetime of work by a huge number of people. And while we want it to happen quickly, that the reality is that it won't, but we also don't want it to take forever, right? Because this is a pressing issue that needs to be addressed. And I think we can all point to all the different kind of examples we have of programs that are, coming from places where people with big hearts, but not really the best guidelines and the best approaches to doing it. And I think that's what we're trying to address here. So yes, working groups, certainly through Shift and other organizations that are working towards this effort to continue this conversation is very important to turn to those groups and contribute in any way that we can. Again, we all have our expertise areas to contribute, and it takes a lot of expertise to do this. I'm going to turn to Terry, to let her talk about what she's heard in her groups.
Okay, so we had the question about reciprocity, and that led to some very interesting conversations. One of the things I wanted to point out was a lot of the people that I encountered in the 2 breakout rooms have not worked with veterans themselves, and they're here to learn. They're interested in trying to figure out what has been done and how they might use existing programming that they have, to engage with another group. And so from that perspective, we move forward. But some of the interesting things is just specifically around the question of reciprocity. Attila mentioned that this is in many ways already built into some of the programs that the military is doing, specifically a program called REPI, for Readiness, Environmental Protection, and Integration, which looks at the buffer areas around military installations and where they are already working. And Kim Pham mentioned this, that in her organizations in Washington State, specifically around Joint Base Fort Lewis, McChord, they partner with scientists who take on veterans as interns and do actual ecological restoration projects. And the scientists are monitoring the ecological progress, and those who are in the behavioral health component monitor the impact on the veterans in terms of self-efficacy and wellness and other things like that. And so as part of the discussion, kind of what came up in both groups was the idea that reciprocity, or that working to restore the earth and to do ecological restoration projects, or even simple things such as trash pickups can be seen as a healing activity, because as the veterans are seeing the improvement in the earth and the planet or their community, that becomes a model for self-healing. So, you know, I'm thinking back to Christian's question during the main session about, you know, is this viewed as too woo-woo? And I don't think so, and I don't think our panelists would say so. I think the reciprocity actually becomes a very important part of the healing process, that essentially is, you know, if they can do it and if they see it, then they can apply it to themselves. The other thing that came out as an important thing is this idea of volunteer work and giving back to a community helps replace the sense of lost mission for many of the veterans, that they, you know, they don't necessarily want to be in a room doing therapy. Even with the veterans that I've worked with, but this comes up over and over again, is they say, oh, it's being physically active. It's being out there with the chainsaw or the weed whacker and, you know, cutting the buckthorn or the kudzu or the privet or, you know, whatever the invasive species is. That's my real therapy. And so being engaged with the volunteer activities, being able to see something done, seeing that you've made progress at the end of the day is so strengthening and empowering. And that's not necessarily something you would see from your daily, you know, your therapy session with a therapist. And so those are the main takeaways. And so I think reciprocity really needs to be on the table.
Right, and that was so, thank you so much for adding all of that in. And one thing I'm just gonna add on to the end of that is the focus in my breakout room was measuring outcomes. And across all of the various programs that are represented here and that we know of, you know, the outcomes can range from something as, you know, tied to a medical diagnosis and symptomologies, things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, stress, all of that is very common. And that was certainly reflected in the survey results that we gathered earlier this summer. But there's more to it than just that, right? And this gets to what Terry was talking about. If we're going to focus on this reciprocity element in some way in some of our programs, what are we measuring there? You know, when veterans say that this is my therapy and I feel better because of this, what is that we're getting at there? Is it, how could we measure that sense of accomplishment, or maybe a sense of identity, right? That they have a sense of a mission again. And so it's tapping into that identity that they've had for so long of serving something bigger than themselves, like a country, but now they're serving the environment, right? How do we measure that and know that we've actually helped develop that sense of identity again? So that's the challenge that we talked about in my breakout group. I'll just throw out some of those main takeaways that what are the outcomes that we could measure? How do we do some of those measurements in terms of using standardized instruments and the variety that are available? But also one of the things I think was a main takeaway is making sure that those outcomes connect to the mission and the vision of the program, and that oftentimes there is a disconnect between that, and that it makes what happens on the everyday efforts in the programs, like when we take our clients out into the communities or into nature or whatever, is what we're doing in our activities aligning with what our mission and vision is or are. And then next step is our measurement aligning, measurement of those outcomes aligning with what we say we're doing in our mission and vision. And sometimes those don't align. And so it makes it very hard to build that rigorous evidence base that Nick talked about earlier this morning when we don't have alignment between those three elements. And so that's some of the work that I've been involved in my own personal work, to work with organizations to make sure there is that alignment between that. Does that change programming when you try to align some of those things? Potentially. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when we want it to be consistent across the board, that's kind of sometimes what needs to happen. And I think that could align nicely with this effort for standardization with still flexibility in there. So that was the main takeaway out of our kind of outcomes breakout groups. Nick, what did you find from your discussions?
I think I've had enough time while everyone's spoken to tabulate.
We jumped right into it, sorry.
No, it's good. I'm glad I went last in that regard. So I think we had about four things. So the main question that we talked about was, what are some of the biggest challenges that you or your organization or your community face in standardizing protocols? And perhaps what are some potential ways to address or overcome these challenges of standardizing protocols? And a challenge that was identified in more than one way was a type of communication issue, whether that's across organizations or really, Linda brought up a really great point of who's going to, coordinate or house these protocols or these types of standardization efforts. And I think that was a really good point. And so we had briefly talked about some type of, in the most ideal world, right? At the end of the day, some type of large, visible national organization would be ideal. And then another thing that we talked about was as a challenge to standardizing things. I mean, you just spoke of aligning your mission, and this kind of goes along with that, and that is convincing providers or higher ups or having type of buy-in conversations about adopting something like this was something, and I don't know as we really had a solution necessarily for that that we discussed. And the third thing that we talked about was kind of cost in two ways. We talked about licensure and credentialing and the cost of that potentially, or also and the accessibility therefore of that, and also this maybe like this credentialing wars type of thing as being a good thing, because of course, this whole conversation is about standardizing something, but at the same time, if there's a cost associated with it, the accessibility is a concern there. And we also talked about the cost of analyzing data or collecting outcomes data, and the fact that a solution to that is, there are university partnerships or other, hospital or academic partnerships, but also organizations that provide free technical assistance and training is one example of something else that may be able to be replicated here, where as a solution to cost, where you have an organization that provides free or low cost training on this type of standardization or the research or the outcomes that comes along with it. And the last thing that we talked about kind of in relation was that some programs, don't just have one activity. It's not just fly fishing or something. It's a whole bounty of activities. And so, the standardization of such things is a little sensitive or might pose a potential challenge. Like how do you standardize social connection? And some of the things that we were talking about, maybe not necessarily saying, well, you need to do it this way, but saying, okay, research shows that having a cohort is a good idea or something like that. And lastly, even if you can't, even if there is a lot of variability in the activities that you have, at least standardizing some type of outcomes, measures, or data or survey design would be really helpful to compare yourself to other programs or against some type of standard.
Yeah, I think that also came out in my group, is that like being able to compare yourself to other groups. And so what are those standardized assessments that are being done across different organizations would be very helpful. And then that would bring back that kind of like clearinghouse kind of idea of here's where all the protocols kind of sit, and here are the assessments potentially that are going to sit, that people are using these assessments, and here's the assessments that you potentially want to use if you want to be able to compare. And I think I want to go back to what Aaron said too from his group, is that like that implementation is like very, like, people get really nervous about that implementation of these types of protocols. And I want to just make a segue into Sally for her people, place, purpose, because I think that there are really great opportunities there of, if you can see it from we're going to talk about people, place, and purpose, but it can fit into how it works with your organization and not just, oh no, you have to do it this way kind of thing. Go ahead.
So thank you.
Go right ahead, Sally.
Yes, because Christian's been asking me to do this, and I think maybe it is an example of I hope, I hadn't thought about it in these terms until now, but a guideline with options. So a flexible guideline, which is brings us, back to this, maybe whether it's the 80-20 or whatever. So I have a serious mentor from the Royal College of Psychiatrists for my program, and he's the Green Care lead on the sustainability committee of our Royal College of Psychiatrists. And for mental health support, they believe that there are 3 key criteria, which I've used to underpin the philosophy, the guideline, the framework for my 10-week program. And that is people, place, and purpose. So we're developing a replicable program, and we'll be moving it from Northern Ireland to Scotland, I think, next, and then the southwest of England. But for and the gardens can be very different, the sites can be very different. So the place will be different. We're in a formal walled garden at the moment, but it could equally be a community allotment. It doesn't have to be a formal walled garden. So the place is going to be different, but they'll be special in their own right. The people, I deal with one community, veterans, well, in fairness, military community, because it's transitioning with poor mental health, and veterans. But they're special people, and everybody that's working with them believes that they're special for the service that they've had. But equally, the horticultural therapists are special people, the practitioners. So the people are special, but they're common in every location in terms of replicability and scalability. The place is going to be different. You work with that place and the resources and the assets in the place. And then purpose, which comes back to a couple of the themes that have come up in this last panel session. There's practical, which is outdoors, all of that's culturally relevant to this community. And there can be complete flexibility within the sessions as to what those practical activities are. But we have 2 themes within our activities. One is practical horticultural skills, so they learn how to do things and prune and plant and propagate, etc. And you could do all of that without an underlying mental health condition, but they also learning the tools, self-help tools of journaling and mindfulness and reflection. So we're combining that. And that comes from University of Copenhagen, which is on the theoretical side, but also from the University of South Florida, and that sort of progression into the community. So there's a lot of flexibility in there, but those themes allow, and our earlier shift conferences, the piece that brings it all together is the 4th P, which isn't in my piece, it's the practitioner. So they work with the people, the place, and the purpose, and that's the bit that sort of turns the key and allows it to be flexible to because in all our cases, it's a trained horticultural therapist. So we have a trained practitioner who is used to working in sessions and with therapeutic objectives, and they work with a gardener and they work with a veteran. So those things are standard. We have a gardener, not therapeutically trained, but believing in this type of approach, a professional therapist, and then a veteran, because in all my cases, actually, those first 2 members of staff are not veterans. And so we have a veteran that helps with the progression element. And that model, I can share my manual with this group. It's not online, but somebody's saying it sounds like a good model. I can share the document that and the references that I've talked about. I can share both the research and the actual manual. They're both available.
I think that would be helpful. Summer, did you want to add on to there?
Yeah, I actually thinking about Sally's model, which we've been so fortunate to learn about, and I was thinking from some of our conversations about the idea of the P's and the practitioner, and maybe it's P squared because there are partnerships among practitioners, sort of this idea of interdisciplinarity and cross-sectoral partnerships that came out in our breakouts. And what that led me to also is, because I'm usually focused on the public health side as an epidemiologist, my mission is usually population health, but a lot of my partners are working on person-centered care, client-centered care. But there's really a kind of beautiful synergy there, because when we think about ways to improve self-efficacy, things that we're doing to benefit our individual clients, and Nick mentioned this with upstream, we also can really work on collective efficacy at the same time. And it brings the reciprocity idea back in, because if individuals are collectively learning how to give back, serve a different mission, learn skills that benefit their community and can translate into other kinds of leadership, then that serves population health goals and societal goals as well. So I just found that really interesting, and thank you everyone for helping me to learn about that.
Well, so I want to come back to that in terms of what we have heard as panelists in our breakout groups that might change or influence our thinking or our work. But before we get there, there was a comment dropped in the chat that I think speaks to what we talked about like 10 minutes ago. The conversation is so good. I'm trying to find good ways to interject with our comments, but this is from Mark Smith. And Mark, if you're willing to unmute and kind of chime in and offer some insight here, you talked about this national clearinghouse that could be a place to kind of consolidate all of this information and keep it as an available resource, widely available resource. But then you dropped a link to an example in the chat. And so I don't know much about that organization, if you want to speak to it and kind of talk about this already existing example.
Yeah, so that's the National Clearinghouse of Rehabilitation Training Materials. And so that's sort of an aggregate or an aggregate site where you can go and see all these organizations that are offering training, technical assistance, and consultation. And it's all usually free or super low cost. And most of those organizations are funded by government grants. And in this case, it's for vocational rehabilitation for folks with disability. And so if I'm an organization, let's say in San Francisco, and I want to provide the latest standardized effective vocational rehabilitation, I go to that clearinghouse and I can find an organization that's going to offer me training and technical assistance, whether it's in protocols or evaluation or any of the latest methods. I can do that, and it's free and funded by these government grants. And there's a number of different clearinghouses, like for different topics. So something like that for Nature for Health would be incredibly helpful. But that was the idea.
Right.
I think Nick talked about it a little bit in our debrief as well.
Yeah, so who funds that, who builds it, and who manages it? I feel like at the end of this, we're going to walk out with more questions than maybe potentially answers to kind of some of the challenges that we're trying to address here. But I think that's okay. I think that just kind of reflects that there's so much work to be done, and we can get there. It's just identifying exactly what we need and the path to follow. It's going to be challenging, but again, lots of brains, and we can all work together on that. So going back to, well, actually, I'm going to address, I'm going to jump to Christian really quick. Where's Christian? We have a couple of Christians in the group, but he wanted to bring in one of our other attendees. Where are you, Christian? Did you want to grab Christine?
Well, yeah. So this is somebody that Christine had reached out initially. Is that you, Christine? And I'm going to let her talk because there's a lot of comparables there that are just so relevant to our conversation.
Yeah, sorry I joined late, y'all. I was juggling Zoom meetings. But there are some familiar faces, and I've been chatting with Semra that she actually works with some of my colleagues. I'm actually an outdoor behavioral healthcare research scientist. And so the Outdoor Behavioral Healthcare Research Center is based out of the University of New Hampshire, where Semra is. And so it's good that there's that cross-pollination. And actually the reason I came to Shift is because I feel like the outdoor behavioral healthcare community has been really doing a lot of good work in this area, also in the area of child and adolescent mental health, but somewhat siloed in the behavioral health sphere. And what I love about what Shift is doing is that there's bringing in a more public health perspective and figuring out how we can get rid of these silos. And Summer, you said it so beautifully, which is like, when I'm doing my work about the client and the client system, and you're doing your work about like the whole public health system, it's the same work, right? I'm a social worker, I'm a clinical social worker, so that person and environment, biopsychosocial reciprocity is real. And Sally, I just love this person, place, people, place, purpose, practitioner model. I love alliteration, so you got me there. But we've been saying, like, how do you help people boil down in the most simplistic and also profound terms, what is the goal of any outdoor therapy? And really that goal is to help the participant connect more deeply with themselves, right? Which is like their sense of identity, their sense of purpose and mission, their own mental, spiritual well-being, and then obviously connect more deeply with others, like those human relationships, whether that's peers or the therapeutic relationship. And then fundamental to our health and well-being, also then making that deep connection with the natural world. So I feel like we're really finding some synergy. And I would love to learn more about your model. And it sounds like you've really gone down the channels, which a good scientist does, of really manualizing that per the evidence. So thank you for doing that work.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I wish, I mean, it's not like.
I appreciate that shout out. And Erin, hi Erin. I've done a lot of work with Erin too over the years with our veteran community. So it's good to see your face too.
Awesome. Well, okay. Thank you for bringing that in. I wanted to talk about what we've learned as panelists, what we've learned and how it might influence our work, but we might end with that question, because I think this is a better segue off of what Christine just said, is what can we do now with all of this knowledge? Like how can we use this to advance the development of standardized protocols, what we've learned? Like I said, we just maybe, certainly in my breakout groups, we answered a lot of questions with more questions. And that might have happened across all of our broad panel discussion and all the breakout groups. But in an effort to kind of have some action come out of this panel, some action steps, or even just point us in the right direction if we can't come up with a step 1, step 2, what do we think we can do to use this to move forward off of this discussion? I think that's open to anybody too, not just our panelists. We have a lot of great minds in this group who've offered some real insights in the breakout groups and this larger discussion here. And so that's open to anybody. That's a deep question.
Could I suggest something here?
Sure.
You know, I think one of the things that has been so interesting is we started this initiative, and there was a recognition that the space could probably benefit from some sort of cataloging of the number of programs that were out there, and then a review to see if there were any sort of standard practices. And you all signed up for the ride, which is absolutely terrific. But I love how it's snowballing. And we're pulling in folks like Aaron Leonard with Sierra Club Military Outdoors, and Dr. Norton, who's doing similar and complementary work with the Outdoor Behavioral Center. And where it got really, and I think that's a really good thing, and Semra, we were talking about this, like, we've got all these survey results, what do we do with them? And there might be people out there that can kind of help parse, and Semra, you have folks like that too. But Aaron brought up something very interesting, and that was this Accelerating Veterans Recovery Outdoors Act. And I wonder if we could bring him on to talk about how the work that we're trying to do here could fit into that act, and we could be, how we might be a little ahead of the curve as that gets passed through Congress.
Sure. Thanks, Christian. I'll keep this brief. The Accelerating Veterans Recovery, and if I'm assume that most folks here are not part of legislative system. So we're in our current session of Congress will end this year. If any bill that's in Congress right now is not passed and signed by the president, then it will have to be reintroduced in the next session. So at the beginning of this session, a Democrat and a Republican member of the House, both by the name of Chris Smith, one from Washington, one from New Jersey, submitted the Accelerating Veterans Recovery Outdoors Act to require the VA and the Department of Defense to study how to incorporate what is essentially wilderness therapy programming within the VA system. There's 20 million living veterans in the US. The average age is 65. 72% of them are white male. It's a demographic that does not represent the United States. The majority of veterans who participate in outdoor programming are young white men. So there's an obvious disparity between that population and marginalized veteran populations, mostly within urban environments. You can study the demographics for a while to see all these different things that you might want to address within your own organization. But for the VA has half of the veteran population as a patient. They're the only organization in the country that can scale any type of program. They're everywhere. They're in all communities. The VA hospital systems have clinics, the vet centers that are staffed by social workers and psychologists and counselors. And they do outdoor occupational therapy and outdoor recreation already in some capacity at different locations around the country. So if they're told to examine how to incorporate wilderness therapy, and this group and others like it are positioned to show the VA how you can measure the benefits and the different types of programs that are effective, then we as a group have a chance to influence what that study recommends back to the VA. The act itself is a study bill. It passed the House unanimously a few weeks ago. It's going to pass the Senate. It's part of a larger package that is consists of a number of bills for veterans. And it's an agreed upon package. So the House and the Senate both agreed that they would pass each other's versions of this bill, even during these times of replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg's position in the Supreme Court and the elections and everything else that's going on. At some point between now and Veterans Day, the Senate will pass the bill as well. It'll get signed into law. And for about 6 or 8 months after that, those departments, essentially the VA and the Department of Defense, are going to study whether or not they want to incorporate wilderness therapy within the VA. That's going to happen quickly. So the first half of 2021, being able to argue that this is a good idea and that the VA would be a good place to house a wilderness therapy program is we need to be prepared to have that conversation with them and to provide that information. The study bill is going to create a committee or a council. There's only going to be a couple, like 2 or 3 nonprofit type organizations that are in there. I have always felt that SHIFT itself would have an opportunity to lobby for its inclusion in that small group. So would other organizations like the YMCA or perhaps even the Outdoor Behavioral Health Council that Christine brought up. All are positioned as experts in the field, so to speak, to advocate for how the VA could approach providing an outdoor behavioral health or wilderness therapy model to its patients.
I'm processing all of that.
Yeah, I would add one other thing, Christian, as you're moving forward. I believe it's very important for you to have an overarching strategy that includes these different elements of what this could become, right? And your strategy, in my opinion, would be like some of us have done risk management for outdoor programming in the past. You include the federal level all the way down to local policy or legislation at a state level, and then how we as a field of professionals also incorporate the work. So it's a tiered approach to strategy development for this type of work.
I think I'd want to comment on that too. I think it's so important to keep the policy piece connected. And thank you, Erin, for bringing that in. I think it's another, I don't know if we want to call it a work group or an avenue for our collective research practitioner minds to work together. And one thing I wanted to ask you, since you seem really well connected with this particular bill, is what you think that the best forum for dialogue is. You already mentioned that key nonprofits are probably the vehicle for communication, and that's helpful to know because probably most people in the US know this, but if you are a state employee, if you work for state government, or even some of us in state universities, there are concerns about lobbying and things like that. But if you partner with a nonprofit who becomes, in this case, the researcher or faculty member's voice, that's completely legitimate. And that's, you know, the way that we're told to advocate in a legitimate way. So maybe there are things you could speak to in terms of the way that the kinds of partnerships that are evolving here could help the efforts that you see, the forums for dialogue. And the other thing that I've done personally is educate staffers of people both on our Washington delegation as well as state, but that's, you know, that's just another, I don't know if that's relevant here or not.
I think there's a lot of ways that we could coordinate in speaking to the right people at the right time. And this is not something that we want to wait to do. This is something that we should be doing right now.
Right.
There's a consortium that can be created. We've done this in the past. I believe Shift even signed on to a letter that my organization, the Sierra Club, submitted to Congress to really start building momentum behind this bill a couple of years ago. So we as a field, you know, each of us on this call, we all know of different groups and different organizations that could come together and have a single voice. We believe the bill is going to pass. We're fairly certain it's going to pass. It's going to be signed into law, but we might need to activate folks to contact their senators, which each of you have 2 of, and we can help to get them more involved. In the state of New York, my state, Senator Schumer is not going to be involved because he's leadership, but Senator Gillibrand was just introduced to this bill. She had never heard of it. And that's often the case with your members, is that they don't know what their staff has not been exposed to. And sometimes all it takes is a real simple email from you, their constituent, to highlight that there's this easy to pass thing going on, and let's get on board behind it. But we likely won't need that. What we would need is to be prepared to communicate to whoever it is that we can influence. And that's what the Sierra Club is currently focused on, is identifying who's going to be invited to participate on the study team. And then which of those agencies, you know, federal agencies, or which of those nonprofit members we have the most influence with, so that we can build that relationship as soon as possible. And then we have to decide, well, how do we want to influence them? And that's the real key here, right, Samra, is what information do we need to have prepared? Like, do we right now have a white paper or talking points or anything other than previously published literature that we can share? Are we prepared to break up into teams of folks to go visit these different offices, whether it's virtually or in person, and advocate for certain elements, so that, you know, the committee is only going to be in play for about 6 months. So we only have about 6 months to really affect it, and it's going to start soon. So these are things that we should be working towards now, so we have the right message to deliver before we even have a set of standards, right? Because the committee could also decide that wilderness therapy is not worth it, if there's not enough evidence that it is beneficial, and it would cost too much to incorporate within the VA system.
So thank you so much, Erin, for discussing all of that. And I wish that we had forever more time to sit here and talk about it. But we are going to run out of time. But I think what we can wrap up here is that, one, with relation to what you just discussed with that bill, the time is now to take advantage of the fact that that is going to go through a process where there's going to be a microscope on this, the nature-based wilderness therapy, outdoor, I mean, we use a lot of terms interchangeably here, right? but this is the time where we can get in and ensure that there is attention paid to this, so that, like you said, it doesn't disappear and that they don't find any value. And then once it's gone, that opportunity is gone, it'll be very difficult to get it back again, to have that be the focus of a task force within our federal government. And so, you know, while that is very much targeting the VA's efforts towards addressing this, we can all contribute to that. And Christian, I'm going to highlight that he has put in the chat that if you're interested in contributing in any way to this, to be a voice to help in this working group, you can send him your information directly. You can drop your contact information in the chat that you'd like to be a part of a working group. And Aaron and I know some other working groups that are doing similar things. And like I said, it takes a lot of people to do this with all the expertise that we bring behind it. And as many people, as you have said, that your senators didn't know, and other people said in the chat that their senators don't know about these things, here we are, there's so many of us doing this, and we have to kind of shout it from the rooftops that, hey, this is what we're doing. And now that you're coming together to look at it, we're going to show you where the benefit is. We might not have that super robust body of literature yet, right? But as practitioners, we all know what our services are doing, like in our hearts, right? And we cannot, I mean, we talk to our clients and our participants, and they tell us what they're getting out of our services. And that is, we know that there is value in that, and we know that what they're saying is authentic to their experience. But what we're talking about is trying to gather that information on a higher level, and we'll get there. But in the meantime, we can stand to some degree on what they are telling us, what their experiences have been. And hopefully we can use that to speak to Aaron's, the bill that he talked about in bringing attention to that, so that we can long-term have something to continue to work on to build that evidence base and come back to that higher level of information. Samara, you just unmuted. Did you want to say anything there?
Oh, only if I have time. I don't want to, I know we're wrapping up, so I have one more comment.
We've got about 2 minutes. If anybody wants to jump in at this stage, we've got about 2 minutes before I'm going to have to wrap us up. And then, okay, so Samara, then Christian.
Okay, I just wanted to say you can also often connect these issues to different committees that your senators and House members sit on, committees on aging, committees on energy. So there's a whole strategy piece we could all think about, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And Christian, do you want to add? Oh, wait, unmute yourself.
If folks are interested, you know, what we would be able to do is, in past shifts, we've incubated projects when good ideas have bubbled up. The timing seems pretty opportune at the moment to stand up a group. The work that we already have in place, we've cataloged 300 plus initiatives that are out there doing this work. We don't think there's another sort of database of the various programs that are out there. So we've got that already. We do have survey results from 70 of them. We've not really parsed those survey results and looked for larger findings or trends. So I think that's something that we have to do. And Samara, we can talk about that. There might be some other folks that'd be interested in helping with that. And then I think, Aaron, you know, to your point, we have some opportunities to grow into some alignment with the initiative that you're talking about as well. But by crowdsourcing this, I think we have an opportunity to get there a lot faster than if we just keep it a small, you know, this sort of tiny little group that we've got. So if anybody's interested, they can email me directly, cb@shiftjh.org, and we can set up some working groups on this.
All right, do we have any last questions or comments by any of our panelists or any of our attendees? This has been a gold mine of information. My brain might be a little bit overloaded at the moment. I just want to sit and think about everything.
I just wanted to say thank you to Nick, who last year was part of our working group that led to the workshop, that then led to the Nature Exposure for Veterans randomized controlled trial, that then gave birth to this program, and to Samra and Jasmine and Jesse and Sally and Deborah, who also joined in to the effort. And I just love the fact that this community continues to grow.
Thank you very much. And I think we are right at the end here. So I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today, for offering your insight, your expertise, and your voices to this conversation about nature-based veterans programming and the efforts to provide high quality services to our servicemen and women. And I think, I mean, gosh, how do we summarize what we just gained out of that 3 hours is that there's a lot more to do, but we have good people doing it, and onward. And feel free to reach out again to Christian or any of us, I think, on the panel would be willing to answer further questions. I know we didn't have a lot of opportunity to get into the nitty-gritty with anybody, but we hope that this panel and the breakout sessions provided some fruitful conversation regarding nature-based veterans-focused programming, and we look forward to advocating for and implementing this work together in the future. And please join us tomorrow to discuss what this research looks like in practice for the rest, as part of the rest of the SHIFT conference.